Just after midnight on July 11th, 1979, people in a small town on the southern coast of Australia woke up to a sound like thunder that wouldn't stop. Outside, the sky was on fire, hundreds of burning fragments, all moving in the same direction, drawing lines across the stars. Some of them landed. One teenager found charred metal scattered in his own backyard. What fell on Esperance that night wasn't a meteor. It was a building. A 77-ton building the United States had put in orbit 6 years earlier, and then walked away from. This is the story of America's first space station, and how it ended up on somebody's lawn. To understand how a space station ends up as litter, you have to go back to what it was built out of. By the end of the 1960s, NASA had won the moon race, and it had a problem. There was spare Apollo hardware sitting in warehouses, Saturn V rockets with nowhere left to go. Congress was cutting the budget. The obvious move was to use what had already been paid for. So NASA took the third stage of a Saturn V, a fuel tank the size of a house, emptied it out, and turned it into a place to live. That was Skylab, 118 feet long, about 77 tons, the heaviest object anyone had ever put into orbit. And inside, it was enormous. Not the cramped capsules of the 60s. Skylab had a shower, a galley with a dining table, sleeping compartments with actual privacy, and next to that table, a large window looking straight down at Earth. Something engineers had argued against because a window is a structural weak point. The crews would spend hours there anyway. On May 14, 1973, 25,000 people gathered at Kennedy Space Center to watch it launch. The rocket carrying it was a Saturn V, the same vehicle that had taken men to the moon. It was the last one that would ever fly. 63 seconds into the flight, the mission started coming apart. Wrapped around the outside of the workshop was a thin metal shield. Its official job was to stop micrometeoroids, small, fast debris that could punch through the hull, but it had a second job that mattered more. It was a sunshade. It kept direct sunlight off the station's skin. 63 seconds in, aerodynamic forces tore it away. Now watch what one failure does. The shield rips loose and wraps around one of the two main solar arrays, pinning it shut. Minutes later, when the second stage separates, exhaust catches the other array and tears it off the vehicle entirely. Skylab reaches orbit with almost no electrical power, and with nothing between it and the sun. Inside, the temperature climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. There was film up there, medication, food for 3 crews, and engineers were worried the insulation would start cooking off toxic gas. There was nobody aboard to do anything about it. The first crew was still on the ground, scheduled to launch the next morning. NASA scrubbed that launch, and then they faced a problem no one had ever faced. How do you repair a spacecraft that's already in orbit, that was never designed to be repaired, using tools that don't exist yet? They gave themselves 10 days. At Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, engineers worked around the clock and came back with 3 separate solutions. The first was a sunshade shaped like a parasol, a folding umbrella essentially, that could be pushed out through a small scientific airlock and opened over the hottest part of the station. The second was a larger twin-pole shade in case the first one failed. The third was a set of metal cutting tools, so the crew could try to free the jammed solar array by hand. All 3 flew. On May 25th, Pete Conrad, Paul Weitz, and Joseph Kerwin launched to find out which one they were going to need. They didn't dock right away. First, they flew around the station to see it with their own eyes, and what they saw matched the telemetry exactly. The shield was gone. One solar wing was missing entirely. The other was held shut by a strip of torn metal. They tried to free it that same day, leaning out of the hatch of their spacecraft. It didn't work. The next day they went inside, into a station that was still dangerously hot, and pushed the parasol out through the scientific airlock. It opened. Within hours, the temperature started dropping. Within days, the station was livable again. That solved the heat. It did not solve the power. So Conrad and Kerwin went outside. Working in pressure suits on a surface with no handholds designed for what they were about to do, they cut through the metal strap pinning the solar array. When it finally let go, the array swung open, and Skylab's power came back. The station had spent a month in orbit as a dying piece of hardware. 3 men turned it back into a laboratory in about 2 weeks. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. And it's worth sitting with this. The plan was drawn up in 10 days by people who had never actually seen the damage. 3 crews lived aboard Skylab, 28 days, then 59, then 84, 171 days of occupation in total. What they did up there is the part that gets forgotten. They ran the first serious long-duration study of what weightlessness does to the human body. Bone loss, muscle atrophy, cardiovascular changes. Almost everything we know about keeping people healthy on the International Space Station traces back to data collected on Skylab. They pointed a solar observatory at the sun for months and rewrote a good part of solar physics. When a comet turned up unexpectedly, they improvised observations of it from orbit. There were 2 spiders aboard as well, Arabella and Anita, sent up for a student experiment to see whether a web could be spun without gravity. The first attempts were a mess. Then they adapted, and the webs came out close to normal. And then there's the story you've probably heard, that the last crew mutinied, that they got fed up with mission control, switched off the radio, and went on strike in orbit. That didn't happen. What happened is that on December 28, 1973, Houston lost contact with the crew for about 90 minutes, one orbit, because of a missed communication pass. The crew was genuinely overworked. NASA had scheduled their day down to the minute, and all 3 of them were rookies. Afterward, the crew and the ground had a long, honest conversation about workload, and the schedule was loosened. NASA has since gone back through the record and stated plainly that no strike and no mutiny ever took place. That crew went on to exceed their science targets. In February 1974, the last 3 men closed the hatch and came home. The plan was to come back. The plan was straightforward. The space shuttle was coming. Early in the shuttle program, a mission would fly up, attach a booster to Skylab, and push it into a higher, more stable orbit. The station would be refurbished and used again. The shuttle didn't come. Funding problems and technical delays pushed its first flight from 1979 to 1981, and the sun was working against them. Solar activity in the late 70s ran higher than forecast, which heated and expanded the upper atmosphere. More atmosphere meant more drag on anything in low orbit, and Skylab was coming down faster than the models had predicted. NASA did try. In 1978, they woke the station up remotely and rotated it into an orientation that would slow the decay. It bought time. It wasn't enough. By the summer of 1979, it was clear Skylab was coming down, and nobody could say exactly where. 77 tons of hardware, some of it dense enough to survive re-entry, on a track that crossed populated parts of the world. The public reaction was not fear, it was a party. Newspapers sold Skylab insurance as a gag, stores ran Skylab sales, people printed t-shirts with bullseyes on them and threw Skylab parties. The San Francisco Examiner offered $10,000 to the first person who could deliver an authentic piece of the station to its office, within 72 hours of it coming down. The paper thought this was a safe bet, since Skylab was not going to land anywhere near San Francisco. On July 11, 1979, engineers fired the station's thrusters to put it into a tumble, hoping to bring the debris down in the Indian Ocean. They were close. Most of it did go into the water. The rest crossed the coast of Western Australia. Which brings us back to Esperance just after midnight, and to a 17-year-old named Stan Thornton, woken up by fragments hitting his house. He walked out into the yard, picked up a handful of charred metal, and, with a plane ticket paid for by a radio station in Perth and a visa pushed through in a hurry, got on a flight to San Francisco with a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and a piece of a space station. He made the deadline, he collected the $10,000, and the Shire of Esperance, surveying the wreckage scattered across its district, issued the United States of America a fine. $400 for littering. It was a joke, and everyone involved knew it was a joke. That's the whole point of it. A rural council in Western Australia applying the same ordinance it would use on anyone who dumped rubbish by the side of the road to the most advanced space agency on Earth. America didn't pay it for 30 years. In 2009, a radio host in California raised the $400 from his listeners and finally settled the bill. There's a museum in Esperance now, in an old railway shed. It has pieces of Skylab in it, oxygen tanks, insulation foam, circuit boards, part of the station's main hatch. It's easy to tell this as a comedy, and the ending genuinely is funny. But the thing that came down over Esperance was a working space station. 3 crews had lived in it. Men had gone outside in pressure suits and cut it back to life with hand tools when everyone expected it to be a total loss. And then it sat empty for 5 years, because the vehicle that was supposed to save it showed up 2 years late.